Hi everybody, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. If you've been following along with the Willys project, you know just about right where we're at. We're going to dive in on the first piece of the truck. I've already had it media blasted, obviously, and on the last video I showed you all the bad spots and all the good spots too. Things we got to fix. And some stuff in here too. So before I even think about working on the fender, I need to get my welder set up. I'm going to use my Hobart Handler 135 MIG. We're going to be dealing with approximately 18 gauge stuff, sometimes a little bit thinner in areas. So basically what I'm saying is I don't want to guess as far as how to set up the welder, because if we just guess at it and then start going for it, if it's too hot, it's going to blow the metal away, and then we're going to have a bigger problem. If it's too cold, then we're not going to get a good union, so on and so forth. So the first thing to do is just spend a couple minutes doing some practice welds. So I'm going to show you that process here. So this is a brand new piece of 18 gauge steel. This is the exact same stuff that we're going to use to repair the body panels. So this is the stuff that I want to practice with as well. All right, so now I've got the two pieces prepped and ready for weld. So if you don't know where to start, usually on these welders on the inside of the door, we're using a gas mixture, 75% argon, 25% CO2, and then the diameter of wire we're using 0.030, and then come over here and look for which gauge we're using. In this case, we're using 18 gauge. Then we just follow this column down to the appropriate row, and it says 2/10. Well, if you come back to the face of the welder, that means voltage setting on 2, wire feeds setting on 10. And that's where they say is a good place to start for what we're trying to do. I'm going to go ahead and clamp the ground wire to one of the pieces. Just trying to make sure the pieces are level with each other. So this first one's going to be 210, and we're going to hold the trigger down for 1 second and see what we get. Let's flip it over. See, this is why we do this, because we did not get enough penetration here. I want to see an actual weld on the bottom side as well. So we're going to go 210 again. This one we're going to go for maybe almost 2 seconds. Let's flip it over. Yeah. See that? See how you can see that little bump right there? That's what I'm looking for. That tells you the weld went all the way through. And by doing so, we know 100% that it also filled the entire gap. However narrow that is, the entire gap between the two pieces of metal. So now I'm going to try the same setting a few times in a row, coming off this tack right here. So this is why we're doing this. We got to get this right before we start working on the real piece. I'm leaving the settings the same, 2 and 10, a second and a half to 2 seconds, maybe at most. And I just increased the gas flow a little bit. We'll see if that helps at all. That's a little better. Just make sure we're still getting good. See, now we didn't get penetration on that one for some reason. Let's try bumping it up to 3. I think this is probably going to be too hot for it, but this is what, that's okay. We're just practicing here. Yeah, we got really good penetration there. almost too much. Yeah, we got to go back to 2. Maybe if I increase the wire speed a little bit on 2. That was a better looking weld on top. Yeah, we got good penetration there on that one. So that was 2 and 20 and about 2 seconds. All right, I'm gonna leave everything the same. We're gonna try to build off this tack. See if we can make a few more good ones in a row here. That looks much better. Okay, I flipped the metal over. We're back on the side where we started. We were going this way. Now we're going to use this little piece right here. Looks like we got good penetration on every weld that time. That looks pretty good. Now what we should do is grind this down on both sides and see how it looks. So this is the top now, and the idea here is that I'm trying to make this metal along the seam where the welds were look identical or as close to it as the surrounding metal, so there's not a line there, there's not any bumps, there's not any holes. I think we accomplished that right here. It looks really pretty good, and that was just with some quick finish up. I could have gotten it much smoother than it actually is, but see how nice that looks. Now the back side, I didn't grind it all the way down. You can still see remnants of the welds on the underside. So I asked my cousins how they wanted the fender welds to be finished. Like they want it perfectly flat, shiny, painted, and pretty, or do we want to put some undercoating on there? And they said they prefer undercoating, which I think is the right decision because it's an East Coast truck. Even though it's not going to get driven probably in the weather a whole lot, we really don't need the fender wells to be painted and pretty and shiny like the rest of the truck. So that means that I have the luxury of leaving some of the weld on the bottom side where the fender well is. So for example, the top, this is the part we might see. This is going to be perfectly smooth and painted, and we're not going to see any evidence of the welds. That's the idea. And the bottom, I'm going to be able to leave some of the weld, cover it with undercoating anyway, and by leaving a little bit of the weld on the bottom, that will also strengthen the joint. So I think we're pretty close to having the welder dialed in. I believe I've finally arrived at both a setting and a technique that's going to work for us. So our first one that we ground down was right there in the middle. Then the second one is right, see that little mark right there is right about in line with that. that's more or less what I'm looking for. And then when the truck finally gets to the paint shop, the guy can finish this all up with some sealant or some body filler or whatever kind of magic and tricks these guys do. But this is going to be plenty good to start with if we can come up with surfaces like this. And like I said before, I think it's going to save the project a lot of money if I do all this tedious stuff before we drop it off at the paint shop. Now, just for fun, we're going to do a stress test on this and see if we can break this weld, see how much it takes. Because even though it looks like we got a good weld and we got good penetration on the back, we also want to make sure that it is strong, because that's the whole point, right? Is to make things strong, not just make them look pretty, but make them strong. Check that out. I could bend it all around where that weld is. You can see the two creases right there. There's one there and one there, but I could not bend it where the weld is. Let me see if we can get a larger tool or something. So let's go ahead and whack this with a sledgehammer on an anvil, see if we can get it to crack. Still hasn't cracked. It didn't crack at all. It's got some hammer marks in there, but that weld is 100% solid still, which is pretty darn amazing. So I'm extremely happy with that. So that not only means our welds are going to be pretty on top, but they're going to be strong too. So good, we can finally move on to the fender. So we've got 3 places on this fender that need to be addressed. This is obviously one of them. That's going to be the most difficult. Then there's an area right in here. You can see all those pinholes. Let me flip it over for you. So this is the other side. This is the fender well where the tire is on the outside of the vehicle. And the third and last area that needs to be addressed on the fender is right in here. Now you can see in here we've got some light to moderate pitting, but that's all it is pitting. The rust did not eat all the way through the metal in here. And this is on the inside of the truck, down low. So I just don't think we need to replace this part right in here. It's plenty thick still, and that's going to be just fine. But down here is pretty thin. And there's several see-through holes right in here. So this is where we're going to start. There's not going to be that much metal that we need to replace. It's relatively straightforward. So basically, I want to take a section. This is just, you know, my first sketch here. This is going to change a little bit when we get going on it, but I basically want to take this section right in here so it kind of looks like a big arrow, if you will. This is the point of the arrow, and this is the base of the arrow. The first thing I'm going to do is just knock this little bent piece down flat, just so we can make a good template. Now I'm going to make this template out of tape, and I'll show you how that, hopefully this will work like I think it will. we need to make a mark at the edge of the tape on the metal so we know where to cut. And it doesn't matter how thick my line is here, because I'm going to take the inside of the line, so I can overlap with the Sharpie quite a bit. And we just take the inside of the line and we'll be good. And I'm also going to trace the holes on the inside of the template, just so we know exactly where they are. We could have done this a couple different ways for the holes. If I make it dark enough, we can see it from the top. And there they are, right there. All right, success. Let's go transfer this to the new metal. I think what I'm going to do here is make a rough cut with the shears, and then we're going to go back and make a precise cut with a die grinder cutter blade. All right, as you can see, I've got the piece fit up to the fender and clamped. I got to come up with a better process for cutting these pieces, because it took me quite a while to get it trimmed right and get it to line up right, and I still didn't get it perfect. You can see right around that corner, it is pretty much perfect. Then we come to the back. Yeah, back's not bad either. You see a little daylight, but then this corner right here, I got a pretty big gap. But what I'm going to try to do is put a couple tacks on the good side over here, work our way around, and see if we can just jump that gap. All right, guys, so here's where we are now. I had to completely scrap that arrow-shaped piece because the metal all around the piece was thinner than I thought it was. I thought we had cut it out to the point where we'd gotten to good metal, but it was still too thin on the fender. I just could not work with that. I had to completely abandon it and cut a much larger spot out. And I even had to test my new bead roller right out of the gate. I made several passes on each one, starting out with kind of a light pressure against the metal, you know, just making a small indentation, a small bead, and then slowly increasing the clamp to make it stronger and stronger and stronger, till finally it made the full bead. So I think I'm back on track here. The bead roller worked great. And by cutting more of the metal out, I was able to find some nice thick metal, or comparatively, it was thicker to work with, and I can actually weld it. Anyway, you can see I've got this side more or less trimmed to fit the original edge here, but the point isn't quite right, and then I've got a lot of extra right here. So the next thing I'm going to do before I finish up the welds is trim this piece off and put a nice round edge on it. And then we can also put those bolt holes in it. And this will also be a good time to stop and let this fender cool off. Although it is cool outside, I don't feel much heat in this anymore. I really want to take my time in between the welds to let things cool down. Maybe shoot some compressed air, maybe get a cold rag after a couple of them and go back and forth. It's because if you start to blow out anywhere, then the rest of the fender is going to want to continue to blow out, and then you're pretty much up a creek. So we have to avoid that at all costs now. So I'm really going to be careful with heat from this point forward. So for those of you out there that are not welders, you've heard me say you got to be careful with the heat on the welder, because if it's too hot, it can blow out the metal, right? Well, I want to show you what blowing out the metal actually looks like and what happens to it. This is just a scrap piece of metal. I'll get a close-up for you in just a minute, but I want to do it again. So this is what I'm talking about. You can see how the metal literally melted away. And if you ever do that on a critical piece, it is extremely difficult to come back from that when it happens. So that's something I really have to be careful with when we're welding panels on the truck, especially when we've already invested 6 hours or more in one panel. Every single time you squeeze the trigger on the welder, you could have a blowout if you're not careful about what you're doing. All right, here it is after I cut the edges off and rounded off the tip like the original piece was. Still got a little bit more work to do, but that's good for now. And I wanted to show you underneath here. So this is on the bottom side now, and I just wanted to show you we're still getting excellent penetration, even though I had to turn the welder down a little bit. This one here is a little bit cold, but we're gonna have to weld around it anyway, so that'll fill in as we go. All right, we're just about done with this piece now, and here you can see me finishing up these oval-shaped holes. And here is the finished product. I think it turned out really nicely for our first patch on the truck. This was actually quite a bit more challenging than I thought it was going to be, because we had this radius curve right there, and then of course we had the beads in there that we also had to mess with. So I didn't have the luxury of a flat surface where it would be easy to grind the welds down. The welds were kind of near the radius, and that made it tricky to do so. But anyway, I got it done, turned out good. I just wanted to show you where we're at now before we move on to the next stage. I think you can probably see I got the welds ground down pretty nicely, as well as I could, against that radius there. The only place that I did not weld was on the beads. You can see there's a line right there, and there's a line right there. I didn't even want to attempt it, because if I did and we started to blow out the metal here on the top of the bead, that would be, at least for my skill set, that would be probably impossible to come back from. So I'm just going to add a little bit of body filler to the lines, and those lines will disappear. I've also got a low spot right there that we can fill just a little bit, and then just some high spots and low spots in here where the radius is. Not so much over here. This one's pretty good, and it's pretty good out here, but there's a couple highs and lows in here that could be better. So just a little bit of body filler in some strategic places is really going to finish this piece off. So that's what I'm going to do now. Before we end this video, I want to show you the process of doing that. I also wanted to show you the underneath side, because remember when we were practicing on that scrap piece of metal with the welder, and I said we had the luxury of leaving some welds on the bottom to strengthen everything. So that's exactly what I did. I ground them down mostly flat, but I didn't take them all the way down to the surface like I did on the top to make them look nice and pretty. Ground them down flat, but they're still there to add strength to our piece. And we know how strong this piece is based on how strong our test piece of metal was after we hit it with the hammer and everything else. And remember, everything in the outer fender well on the underside of the fender where the tire goes, everything in here and here and all the way down to the end is going to be covered with undercoating, including our piece right here. So as you probably know, the undercoating stuff is thick, and sometimes it even has a texture to it and everything else. So once we put the undercoating on, we're not going to be able to see these welds at all. It's just going to blend right into everything. And one more thing I wanted to mention before we move on here, you can see the original bead comes down here to meet our new bead that we fabricated, and the lines pretty much match up perfectly. So our new ones were pretty much in line with the old ones after I fabricated them, but it wasn't like 100% perfect. So what I did is I just took a hammer and dolly and some chisels and some other tools to redefine the line where they meet. I also used the hammer and dolly to get the level correct, the height of the new bead versus the height of the old bead, where they met. You can see they meet pretty much perfectly now. They're like, you know, they butt up next to each other side to side, and they're the same height. So that was some tedious work too. I just wanted to mention that real quick before we go on. Okay, so now we're going to prep the metal for the body filler. Just blow it off a little bit first. And I've got some POR 15 cleaner degreaser that we're going to spray on here. And we're going to kind of rub it in with a porous sponge here. We want to get all the metal dust, of course, and all the impurities from touching it with our fingers and tools and sandpaper and everything off of there. This sponge has a coarse side and a smooth side. So just one more time here. We're going to dry this completely with some compressed air. Now we're going to take some POR 15 metal prep. This solution does 3 different things. It's got a rust converter in it, so even though we can't see rust, there's rust in there because it's been exposed to the atmosphere for many days. It also has some form of acid in it. I forget what kind of acid, but what the acid does is it leaves an etched finish to the metal, so the primer will stick to it. So when we're done with the metal prep, the surface will be etched, so we don't have to use a self-etching primer. We can use a regular primer. In this case, I'm going to use an epoxy primer. I'm going to show you that when we get there. The third thing it does is it leaves a layer of zinc coating to the metal, so that when we're done applying the metal prep, the metal from here on forward will be completely protected from the elements. POR 15 metal prep, there's other stuff on the market too that will do the same thing, but we're going to try this. The instructions say to spray it on and let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes so the acid has a chance to get in there and etch the metal, and the rust converter has a chance to convert the rust. We're going to do the new piece that we made and just go up a little bit on the fender. Eventually I'm going to do this with the entire fender before we move on to another part of the truck, but for now we're just going to do this one section to demonstrate. Okay, we'll start the timer on that. So while we're waiting for the metal prep solution to cook on there and do its thing, I wanted to talk about primer a little bit. And I want to say up front that I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, but this is what I know about it, all right? If you got a bare piece of metal that's just been sandblasted and you say, oh, I need to get some primer on that to protect it from the atmosphere so it doesn't rust, and you just take your everyday Rust-Oleum or whatever other brand primer and spray it on directly on the metal without doing any metal prep or anything beforehand, I got news for you. It's not going to protect the metal from the atmosphere. And the reason is that primer is porous. So you're going to get this primer laid down on your bare metal and think you did a good thing by protecting your metal, but it's still going to rust because the atmosphere is going to get through the primer. I had a good friend tell me once, if you want to preserve bare metal, like the quick and dirty way to do it, like you're going to store it and then come back and fix it later, is to, instead of using primer on it, just take paint and spray regular paint on directly on the metal. And paint will protect the metal from the atmosphere where regular primer won't. So good enough, right? Regular primer is not going to protect the metal from rust. Then we have the self-etching primer, which some of you know about and some of you probably don't. This is the next best thing for a kind of a quick and dirty job that will actually might work. If you have a clean bare piece of metal and you have some good quality self-etching primer, spray this on your piece, you're going to have a much better chance of this stuff protecting the metal from the atmosphere than you would with just a regular type of primer. You should still paint over this in a timely manner, but this stuff is way better than just the regular primer that you pull off the shelf. What I seem to have found is that what they do with the metal is do exactly what we did. They clean the metal and then they prep the metal with an acid solution, and then before they apply the body filler directly to the bare metal, they spray it with this epoxy primer stuff. So you've got the metal prepped with the zinc coating and it's already etched. You spray this epoxy primer on top of that. This will protect the metal from the atmosphere. And this is why we're putting the primer on first and then the body filler on top of the primer, because the body filler is porous also. So if you have the bare metal and then put the body filler directly on top of the metal and then put some regular primer on top of that body filler, you're asking for trouble. And I have a feeling that's what happened to this truck. Somebody went to the trouble of priming it and putting body filler on it and painting it, but the metal surfaces weren't prepared correctly and it just rusted from the inside out because it was not properly protected from the atmosphere. All right, so it's been 20 minutes and it's time to remove the solution from the fender. And you might think this is counterintuitive, but the thing you remove the solution with is water. And you think, well, don't put water on a bare metal fender, it's gonna rust. Well, you have to remember that the area that we put the metal prep on is now covered with a zinc coating, so it's not exposed to the atmosphere anymore, so water's not gonna hurt it. All right, I've got it completely dry now. And I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but the metal actually has a slightly different color to it. It's just a kind of a different color gray. So this epoxy primer stuff is usually something that is mixed and then put into a spray gun and, you know, sprayed on like paint. But they do make aerosol cans of it too. The only trick is that you have to break the baffle inside. So shake it up real good. Take this cap that was originally just, you know, on top as part of the packaging, and then you put it onto that little stem and then you press down on it. And that breaks the baffle between the two parts inside the can. Now we have to shake it thoroughly again. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply it. Man, this stuff is really nice. It sprays very well. Doesn't seem to be prone to running. By the way, these cans are about 30 bucks a piece, so you wouldn't want to do a whole vehicle with something like this. You'd want to mix it up and do it the normal way, but when we're doing a piece at a time here and there, to be honest, this is probably the easiest way to go. The only problem with this stuff, besides that it costs 33 bucks or something like that a can, is that once you break the baffle and mix the elements together inside there, I think they say you only have 3-4 days before it becomes unusable. So now I've got the epoxy primer laid on there, and you can see the lines a little bit better between the two beads. That's where we're going to add some body filler. There's a low spot right there with a couple of dimples, and also there's a dimple there and a dimple there. The rest looks fantastic, so I'm really happy with this. I think it's going to look great here when we get the body filler on it, and we can move on. All right, the epoxy primer has dried completely. Now it's time to add the body filler and finish it off. This is the stuff I'm using. It's 3M lightweight body filler. Now you might not be surprised to hear that there is quite a science behind body fillers as well, just like everything else, right? One of the things the pros say is to not mix your filler on cardboard like most of us do or have in the past. You know, it's such an easy thing to get a square piece of cardboard. They say, no, don't do it on cardboard. You're going to get fibers mixed into your material and it's going to be contaminated or whatever. So I said, okay, fine, I'll try to do it on paper like the pros say to do. The other thing that's interesting is knowing how much hardener to use. You may not realize, but a lot of the pros weigh this stuff. They get their body filler from the can just like we did, put it on a scale, take the weight of it, and then do some math and add 2% of the weight of the filler in hardener. But we're not going to do that. I read somewhere that said if you have like a 2-inch circle of it on your pad there, then you add about that much, like a bead that goes halfway across your puddle. If your filler mounted to about a 4-inch circle, then you would do a bead all the way across that 4-inch and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think a lot of the pros actually weigh this stuff to get it exactly right. 2% hardener to filler. And there's probably even a science to mixing this stuff. Now that I'm doing it, I think I remember some guy doing like a figure 8 versus the way I was doing it just a minute ago like this. Said no, it's better to do a figure 8 for some reason. And then I've also learned that once you get it mixed, it's better to thin it out on your pad here rather than leave it in a blob, because that blob will harden much faster than it is if it's laid out thin like this. So if the pros do it, we can certainly do it that way too. And I'm afraid I mixed way too much of it for what I'm trying to accomplish here, because the more of this stuff you get on your material, the more you have to take off. So you definitely want to hit your low spots and make sure they get filled in, but don't just completely glob it on there and take forever to sand off. These pallets are pretty cool because it's a pad of paper basically, and when you're done with the the top layer that you're using, you just tear it off. There's a fresh one below it. And it's a pretty thick pad, so a guy like me is probably going to have this thing forever. And then it's got a little clip there where you can put your little tool. All right, the filler is almost ready to sand, but I actually made a mistake here. I wonder if anybody caught it. What I should have done before I applied the filler was to scuff the surface of the primer with some coarse sandpaper, like some 80 grit or some 100 grit or something like that, the filler, so I had a good rough surface to bind to. I'm still going to be okay with this piece because it's such a small amount that's going to be left over. Well, after a fair amount of sanding and touch-up work, another light coat of epoxy primer, and then I also put a coat of satin black on it just to finish it off. Of course, that's not going to be the color we paint the truck, but I just wanted to see the fender with a little bit of glossy paint on it. So here's what we got. I can finally show you guys the finished product here. And I also got the underside finished as well. So because this was the very first patch panel on the whole truck, just the tip of the iceberg, this took me a very long time. It took me a lot longer than it should have, because I didn't yet have a process that I was confident with. But now that I've got it finished, I think I do have a process that I'm confident with. So the next patch we do is probably going to take only half that much time, maybe even less, because I know what to expect. And you know what's actually kind of funny about this is this little corner piece here on the fender, as much work as we put into that, as much time as I have into it, we're not going to see it. This is the inside of the engine compartment. Here, let me show you on the truck where it actually is on the passenger side. Way down there, and you can see the 2 bolts that are going into the frame to help mount the fender. So that piece is a structural piece, so we didn't completely waste our time on it. So to a small degree, the piece that we fixed here on the fender was kind of a practice panel in a way, but it was still necessary because the old stuff was very thin, and there was at least a half a dozen pinholes through the metal, and some were even bigger than pinholes. And because that's a structural place on the fender, it was a necessary repair. And I'm very happy with the way it turned out. Some of you might think I'm crazy for spending this much time on such a insignificant piece. So I don't care if it's the top of the fender or the hood or someplace you see all the time, or someplace like this that you're not going to see very much at all. I'm going to try to do my best on every single piece. As I move forward with this bodywork, I'm not going to document to the same degree as I did this little piece right here, but I'll show you more of the highlights of each step as I go along. For example, this is going to be a real trick. This is what I'm going to tackle next. I had intended to put this repair in this video, but this video is getting too long for that. So this repair is probably going to be its own video. We got to take this much out to here, and then right about there, and then across to here, and then the whole rest of it has to be removed. So this one's going to be tricky. I don't think I'm going to be able to do this one all with one single piece of metal. I think it's going to be at least 2 pieces, maybe 3. I'm not sure. We'll see when we get there. I've already got some cardboard taped up to the fender where the bulk of the missing areas are, and the sole purpose of this cardboard is so I can make a decent template out of it. If you guys want to see the rest of this project, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you get notifications when the new videos come out, and wish me luck. This is going to be interesting. Anyway, check out antiquecarsandstuff.com. That's one of the ways I help fund the channel. We've got new hoodies in stock and new beanies as well. Thanks everybody for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video.